brush look at several things that Absalom took from David during the course of this coup. So we won't go verse by verse, but we'll just kind of jump around and notice a few things. But the question was raised last week. All right. I want us to start by just noticing all the things that Absalom took from David. Let me preface it with just a little bit of what's going on. I don't think we're going to go back and spend a lot of time next week on the intrigue that's happening. When David leaves Jerusalem, he leaves behind the Ark of the Covenant. The priests had decided they would bring it to go with David. They felt that it belonged in his camp. David sends them back and says, you take the ark and you go back and keep it in the tabernacle. And as an opportunity for you to keep an eye on things. Then if we have any news, any spy business that comes up, then you would be less likely for somebody to follow you. So maybe you can come and bring me the news. So eventually he finds out what Absalom is doing and how things are going with Absalom, mainly through the fact that he has some folks that are there. He has Ahithophel. We mentioned last week that Absalom had taken Ahithophel, his daddy's counselor, to be in his camp. There's another counselor that they all trust, and David leaves him behind in Jerusalem as well to kind of confound the conversation. So if you read through 15, 16, 17, 18, you'll see that there is an occasion that comes up when Ahithophel has probably the right idea, but David's spy in residence gives him the other advice and pretty well saves David's life and the lives of a lot of people that were with him. So anyway, we'll run through this and look at several things. I've got 7 on my list. You might notice others. Things that Absalom took from David in the course of this coup. First one we've already talked about. He took Hebron. Previously, David had ruled over Judah from Hebron. This is while Saul's family was still governing from their hometown. And there's that civil war that takes place. And David eventually is triumphant, moves to Jerusalem, and sets up a national government. Well, Absalom goes to the same place, uses some of the same tactics by drawing to him the outliers, the people that were not really connected to David, and getting ready to start his government. So he uses David's own strategy and takes over that place at Hebron. The second thing also we've mentioned before, he gets Ahithophel, who is David's counselor. If you want somebody that has a proven track record to run your campaign. So since he did a good job for David, then maybe he'll do a good job for me. And I have several passages, several verses that I want us to read just kind of rapidly. Chapter 15, verse 12. You could try to follow along with these. While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Gilo, his hometown. So the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing. So we get an update on how Absalom's doing, but one of the reasons that his following gets better seems to be the fact that he has enlisted Ahithophel. People looked at Ahithophel and said, well, if he's with Absalom, then it's probably worthy of us to follow as well. Go over at 1531. David had been told Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. So David prayed, Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. So David says, I can't do anything about where he is, but maybe God can do something about what he is saying. 16 verse 20. 16 verse 20. Absalom said to Ahithophel, give us your advice. What should we do? Ahithophel answered, sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all of Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be more resolute. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with his father's concubines in the sight of all of Israel. Now in those days, the advice of Ahithophel, the advice that Ahithophel gave, was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. So all of Israel's watching Ahithophel. And what Ahithophel says, Absalom's going to do that because that's what the people, they trust him and they think that he is going to give all the right advice at all the right time. But we run across one of the other things that Absalom takes from his father. He takes his harem. When David was leaving, his harem wanted to go with him. And David said, no, I want you to stay here and take care of the house. Stay here. And, I don't know whether he felt like they would be safe from whatever was coming or whether he just assumed that that was the right place for them to be. So house servants just stay here and take care of the house. When Absalom arrives and asks Ahithophel what to do, Ahithophel tells him to do exactly what Nathan already told David was going to happen. You remember way back when David sleeps with Bathsheba. Something like this is going to happen to you, but it's not going to happen in private like you and Bathsheba. No, this is going to happen publicly so that everybody knows. And so here's the fulfillment of what Nathan had told David. It's a power play. It is a way of saying that nothing my father has can he keep from me. I have all the power and he has none. And then, of course, as Ahithophel told him, it will make you so noxious in your father's sight. Right? If anybody's still on the fence and says, well, it's David's son and we love David and we hate to mess with David's son, this is going to drive a wedge. This is going to make people choose one side or another. And when it happens, the people of Israel don't rise up in rebellion and say, oh, what a terrible thing. The people of Israel said, oh, Ahithophel, he must be right. If Ahithophel is with him and counseling him to do these things, then Ahithophel must be right. Get 17:14. 17:14. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. So Hushai the Archite is the one that David left behind. There are two groups of advice given concerning what do we do about David. Right? David has left the city, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But as David leaves, the question is, what should we do? Ahithophel says, chase him down, just kill David, and bring everybody else back. Eventually, they'll fall into line, and they'll be your followers. But Hushai says, no, it'll turn out to be a massacre. David's probably already run to ground. He's hiding somewhere in a cave. If you follow him now, then there's going to be a big battle and lots of people are going to die. So what you need to do is wait. And Absalom decides to take Hushai's advice and wait. So look at 17:23. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. So he was so used to being heard. And then all of a sudden, the king no longer takes his advice. Well, whose counselor can he be now? He was David's counselor at Hebron. David did well. He was Absalom's counselor at Hebron, and then at Jerusalem, things didn't go so well. And instead of saying, well, I'll hang around and see how this works out, he immediately goes and takes his own life. David was kind of laughing the other day when you watch the videos on Facebook that sometimes we have kung fu. You know, my mouth is doing one thing and my voice is doing another on these things. But we're talking about an Eastern mindset, not a Western mindset. So when people read this, they probably weren't very surprised that that's what Ahithophel did. It would make sense to them that since his honor had been betrayed and he was no longer being listened to by the king, that he might as well just kill himself. In their culture, more than ours, somehow that would make sense. So he stole Hebron, he stole Ahithophel, he stole the hearts of the people. Absalom has been working on this for somewhere between 4 and 40 years to get everybody on his side. David won battles. Right? He was famous for being a great warrior. Absalom is more famous for flattery. He's a nice guy. So he's more of a peacetime king, although as ruthless and bloodthirsty as he seems to have been. But he wasn't a warrior. And so he took the hearts of the people away from David, so that when something like go and kill David and just bring the people back and they'll fall into line eventually, when Ahithophel gives that advice, it seems like good advice because the people love you more than they love David now. So everything has shifted. We'll just get rid of your dad and everything will work out from there. Okay, let's go back to 15. Chapter 15, verse 30. Another thing that he took from David was his dignity. Look at 15, verse 30. 15:30. David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered, and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too, and they were weeping as they went up. Now David had been told Ahithophel was among the conspirators with Absalom, so David prayed, Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. When David arrived at the summit where people used to worship God, Hushai the Archite was there to meet him, his robe torn and dust on his head. So everybody around David is showing humiliation. They're in a terrible state. And I didn't write it down, but we'll run over real quick to the kind of the end of the story. Where do I want to be? Chapter 18 and verse 19. 19:1. Okay, back up one more. 18:33. This is my final offer. 18:33. The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Joab was told, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And for the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard and said, the king is grieving for his son. The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. The king covered his face and cried aloud, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." And Joab went into the house to the king and said, "Today you have humiliated all of your men who have just saved your life, the lives of your sons and your daughters, and the lives of your wives and your concubines. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you." So Absalom stole his dignity from him. I mean, he's going around whining and crying and screaming out his dead son's name. And here come the armies that defeated Absalom, and they have to just kind of slink back into town. So he's just overwhelmed. His dignity is gone. In the meantime, he takes over the city of Jerusalem, and he's not encamped there for very long, but long enough to do damage to David's reputation. He takes over his harem. We've already talked about that while he's there. And just his honor in general. People are looking at David, and he's no longer that man that, you remember when he was in the desert, and when people would run away from injustice, they would run to find David. And as he was out in the desert, his numbers kept growing, and we saw him with a couple of hundred, and then we saw him with 400, and then there were 600, and then there were thousands, and all through his young career, these people came to him because he was a man of honor, and everybody thought highly of David. But Absalom's rebellion just changes all of that. He's a shell of a man, he's a shell of a king, and the people are looking back, trying to find that David that used to be their king, and he's just not there anymore. He is just broken. Where did all of this start? It started with Bathsheba. And Nathan told him that things were going to fall apart and that members of his own house were going to cause his downfall, and sure enough they did. Now there's still some great things going on in the kingdom. He's still sitting as king. He sits as king for 40 years, which is really good if you look at the track record of kings in Judah. Not all of them got to sit as king that long. He's going to set in his place, by God's design, King Solomon, and Solomon's going to reign a long time over a very wealthy, a very peaceful kingdom under Solomon's reign. But as far as David at this point, you think about presidents after the election, right? You've got an election in November, and then they go out of office January on inauguration, and that time in between, who's this guy? He's already done. And some people will try to defend them, but they're what? We call them a lame duck president. In a lot of ways, David is a lame duck king after this time. He's still the royalty, but he just doesn't have the kind of honor that he had back in the day. So I would say probably particularly the older people around Jerusalem felt it more than some of the younger people. Some of the younger people might have seen him as the conquering hero whose son tried to lead a coup, but David was strong enough and was able to oust him. But the old folks, they knew. They'd been around long enough to see the David before and after and see some of the things that had come to fruition. We might take a little bit of time next week to talk about some of the espionage and the battle itself. But the bottom line is we have another one of those cases where David gives a command and is ignored by his general. You remember early on when we're talking about Absalom, it describes his beauty. He was a good-looking guy, and he grew so much hair between haircuts and it talks about the weight of his hair. Guy's just got beautiful, long, flowing hair. And during the course of the battle in the woods, his hair gets caught in the branches of a tree, and he's left hanging there. Well, his troops desert him. There's not a circle of life around him. They've been routed, and they're out of there. And so some of David's troops, Joab's troops, find him hanging there. David's direct orders were, don't kill him. Joab gets the word that he's hanging there, and he tells the people that come to give him the news, well, why didn't you kill him if he's hanging there? Why didn't you run a javelin through him right then? And he says, I'll take care of it myself. So Joab travels to where Absalom is hanging from the tree, and he takes 5 javelins and runs him through with 5 javelins to kill him. The hatred that Joab had and maybe the pride in winning the battle, this guy led a bloody coup against your king. What's your job? Your job's to kill him. But what did your boss say? He's my son. Don't kill him. And maybe Joab could see a little bit into the future here, But after Joab kills him, he's standing in David's presence saying, why are you crying? You're making yourself look bad. All of your soldiers that saved you had to sneak into town. So where's your loyalty? You love the ones who hate you more than you love the ones who love you. But this is Joab speaking, and Joab's the one that killed his son. So it's nothing good happens in this portion of Scripture. I guess if you are an Israelite and a David fan, then David wins back his place on the throne. God's anointed, the man after God's own heart, wins and is reseated on his throne in Jerusalem. But beyond that, everybody loses. David loses, Absalom loses, Joab is going to lose. There's nobody that comes out of this really with a great victory that you could trace for years to come and say, wow, isn't that great that they won that battle in the woods? So if you want to read more of that section, I would kind of leave that up to you, and we'll just move on next week. Any questions or thoughts about any of that? Our designated question asker is not here, so if anybody else have a question? No? Okay, we'll leave it right there. We'll tell you guys bye.